Don Quixote Summary. Introduction. In the vast world of classic literature, few books shine as brightly as Don Quixote, written by the Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes in the early 17th century. Often called the first modern novel, it has inspired writers, philosophers, and dreamers for over 400 years. At its heart, Don Quixote tells the story of a middle-aged man from La Mancha, Spain, who becomes so obsessed with tales of knights and chivalry that he decides to transform himself into a knight-errant. With rusty armor, an old horse, and a head full of fantasies, he sets out to fight injustice, rescue damsels in distress, and bring back the glory of knighthood to a world that no longer believes in it. But this story is more than just comedy or adventure. It is about the power of imagination, the struggle between reality and illusion, and the eternal human desire to chase dreams, even when the world calls them impossible. Don Quixote is both a tragic figure and a symbol of hope, someone who fails again and again, but never stops believing in something greater than himself. Cervantes weaves humor, philosophy, and social criticism into every chapter, making Don Quixote not just a novel, but a mirror of human nature. It's a story about madness that feels strangely sane, about failure that feels heroic, and about dreams that outlive reality. And so begins one of the greatest journeys in world literature, the adventures of Don Quixote of La Mancha. Don Quixote's madness and becoming a knight. Don Quixote was not born a knight. He was simply Alonso Quixano, a respectable but lonely middle-aged man living in La Mancha, Spain. He spent his quiet days reading book after book about knights, heroes, battles, and romances. These tales filled his imagination so completely that the line between fantasy and reality began to blur. Night after night, he devoured these stories, convinced that the world desperately needed the return of knighthood. Slowly, his obsession transformed into madness. He began to believe that he himself was chosen to restore honor, justice, and glory to Spain. With unwavering determination, he dug out his grandfather's rusty armor, patched it together with strings and scraps, and named himself Don Quixote de la Mancha. To complete his transformation, he looked at his old skinny horse, an animal more fit for retirement than for battle, and christened it Rocinante, a name that sounded noble though the horse was anything but. But no knight can exist without a lady to serve. Don Quixote chose a peasant woman from a nearby village, Aldonza Lorenzo, and reimagined her as the beautiful and virtuous Dulcinea del Toboso. Though she had no idea of his devotion, in his mind she became the radiant lady for whom he would fight, suffer, and conquer. Finally, Don Quixote declared himself a knight-errant. He polished his armor, mounted Rocinante, and set off into the world, ready to defend the helpless, destroy evil, and create a new age of heroism. It was the birth of a dream, but also the beginning of a comedy. For Don Quixote was a knight in name only, armed not with strength or wealth, but with illusions and stubborn faith. The first adventures, giants, windmills, and illusions. Once Don Quixote stepped onto the dusty roads of La Mancha, the real world collided with the world inside his imagination. Almost immediately, he looked for ways to prove his knighthood. His first stop was an inn, which to his eyes looked like a grand castle. The innkeeper, amused by Don Quixote's strange behavior, played along. In a mock ceremony, he knighted Don Quixote using a book instead of a sword. To everyone else it was a joke, but to Don Quixote it was a sacred ritual, the official beginning of his life as a knight. Not long after, Don Quixote spotted his most famous enemies, giants. At least that's what he believed. In truth, they were nothing more than giant windmills, their long wooden arms spinning slowly in the wind. Convinced they were monsters terrorizing the land, Don Quixote charged at them with his lance. The windmill's arm caught him and threw him to the ground, bruised and humiliated. But even in defeat he insisted he was right, claiming that an evil sorcerer had transformed the giants into windmills to rob him of his victory. This scene became one of the most iconic in world literature. A man battling windmills, believing he was fighting giants. It symbolizes both the foolishness and the nobility of chasing dreams against impossible odds. Despite the pain and laughter of others, Don Quixote never wavered. Every peasant became a noble, every inn a castle, and every shadow a villain. His madness gave him strength, and his illusions became the fabric of his reality. These first adventures showed the world who Don Quixote truly was, not a warrior of flesh and steel, but a warrior of imagination, forever tilting at windmills. Sancho Panza joins the journey. No knight can ride into adventure alone, not in books, and certainly not in Don Quixote's mind. Every true knight-errant needs a loyal squire, and so Don Quixote turned to a simple, practical farmer from his village, Sancho Panza. Sancho was the opposite of his master in almost every way. Where Don Quixote was tall, thin, and full of lofty ideals, Sancho was short, round, and rooted in everyday concerns like food, drink, and a comfortable bed. Don Quixote promised him something irresistible. If Sancho joined him as his squire, he would be rewarded with riches and, most importantly, governorship of his own island. The idea of ruling an island, though absurd, was enough to spark Sancho's imagination. Against all common sense, he saddled up his donkey, Dapple, and followed Don Quixote into a world of madness and dreams. From the start, their partnership became the heart of the story. Don Quixote's wild visions clashed with Sancho's down-to-earth realism. When Don Quixote saw giants, Sancho saw windmills. When Don Quixote imagined castles, Sancho pointed out they were inns. Yet despite his doubts, Sancho grew attached to his master's idealism. He began to believe, at least a little, in the possibility of something greater. Their conversations were as important as their adventures. Don Quixote spoke of honor, destiny, and eternal glory, while Sancho replied with proverbs, jokes, and practical advice. Together they created one of literature's greatest duos, a dreamer and a realist, walking side by side down the same dusty road. Sancho's loyalty, though often tested, never broke, and Don Quixote, for all his madness, treated Sancho not as a servant, but as a companion. This unlikely bond gave the story both humor and depth, making their journey unforgettable. Adventures filled with humor and tragedy. Once Don Quixote and Sancho Panza set out together, the dusty roads of Spain became the stage for countless adventures, some hilarious, some heartbreaking, and many a mixture of both. The beating of the innocent boy. One of their earliest encounters was with a poor boy tied to a tree and being whipped by his master. Don Quixote, seeing injustice, demanded that the man release the boy and pay him his wages. The terrified master promised obedience. Believing he had restored justice, Don Quixote rode away proudly. Yet no sooner had he left than the master continued to beat the boy even more severely. It was a cruel reminder that Don Quixote's illusions often made things worse instead of better. The battle with the merchants. Not long after, Don Quixote encountered a group of traveling merchants. He demanded that they proclaim Dulcinea the most beautiful woman in the world. When they laughed at his absurd request, he attacked them. But Rocinante stumbled, and Don Quixote fell to the ground, beaten and humiliated by the very men he had challenged. It was another lesson that his world of fantasy clashed painfully with reality. Sancho's struggles. Sancho, meanwhile, bore the brunt of many of these misadventures. He was beaten, tossed in blankets, mocked, and left hungry more often than not. Yet he continued to follow Don Quixote, partly for the promise of his imaginary island, partly out of loyalty, and partly because, despite the madness, life with Don Quixote was never dull. The blending of comedy and pain. Readers laughed at Don Quixote charging at windmills or demanding impossible oaths, but they also felt pity for his suffering. The adventures showed the fragile line between comedy and tragedy, making the story richer than simple parody. Don Quixote's failures, though constant, never broke his spirit. Every defeat only strengthened his conviction that the world needed him, that he was destined for greatness. And Sancho, bruised and battered, remained by his side, an anchor of reality tethered to a man lost in dreams. Encounters with the real world versus his fantasy. As Don Quixote and Sancho Panza continued their journey, the gap between his imagined world of knights and the harsh reality of Spain grew ever wider. Everywhere he looked, Don Quixote saw signs of enchantment, injustice, or adventure. But more often than not, the truth was painfully ordinary, and the consequences of mistaking one for the other were both comic and tragic. The flock of sheep. One day, Don Quixote spotted what he thought was an approaching army. Dust rose in the distance, and to him it looked like hundreds of soldiers marching toward battle. In reality, it was just a flock of sheep being herded across the fields. Convinced of the danger, Don Quixote charged in, swinging his lance. The terrified shepherds fought back, pelting him with stones until he lay bruised and battered on the ground. Still, he claimed that an evil sorcerer had disguised the soldiers as sheep to rob him of his glory. The prisoners escape. In another encounter, Don Quixote came across a chain gang of prisoners being marched under guard. Believing they were innocent men unfairly enslaved, he attacked the guards and set the prisoners free. Instead of thanking him, the convicts beat him and Sancho before scattering. His quest for justice once again ended in humiliation. Sancho's realism versus Don Quixote's vision. Sancho repeatedly tried to pull Don Quixote back to reality. He pointed out the sheep, the inns, the ordinary people for what they really were. But Don Quixote refused to accept the truth. To him, Sancho simply lacked imagination, blinded by the dullness of the real world. Yet Cervantes also shows how Sancho, despite his practicality, sometimes began to see things through his master's eyes. He wavered between skepticism and belief, caught in the strange magic of Don Quixote's madness. Comedy meets tragedy. These encounters highlight the dual nature of the novel. They were often funny, laugh-out-loud moments of absurdity, but also deeply tragic. Don Quixote was not merely a clown, he was a man desperately trying to live by ideals that the world no longer valued. His defeats were not just physical, they were symbolic of the clash between dreams and reality, the road of disappointment and reflection. As Don Quixote's journey wore on, his endless defeats began to weigh on him. Though his spirit remained unbroken, reality had a way of cutting deeper with every failure. His body carried bruises, his armor was bent and rusted, and his reputation as a madman spread from village to village. The mockery of the Duke and Duchess. One of the cruelest chapters of his adventure came when Don Quixote and Sancho were invited to the castle of a Duke and Duchess. At first it seemed like an honor, nobles recognizing the greatness of a knight-errant. But in truth, the Duke and Duchess saw Don Quixote as nothing more than a source of amusement. They played elaborate pranks on him, sending him on false quests, inventing magical prophecies, and setting up humiliating spectacles. Don Quixote accepted everything with sincerity, never doubting their words, while Sancho enjoyed his moment of power when he was mockingly appointed governor of a fake island. But even this joke ended in disaster, as Sancho quickly realized the burden of responsibility and gave up his post in despair. Reflections on honor and reality. Amid the laughter and trickery, Don Quixote began to reflect on his life. Why did the world reject chivalry? Why did people mock what he held sacred? Though he rarely admitted defeat, a quiet sadness grew within him. His dreams of restoring knighthood seemed more distant with every step. Sancho, too, began to see the futility of their adventures. While he still cared for his master, he could no longer believe in promises of kingdoms and glory, yet his loyalty endured. Even as reality crushed their hopes, the bond between the dreamer and the realist remained unshaken. The slow march toward the end. The road was no longer filled with excitement, it was a path of exhaustion, doubt and fading illusions. Don Quixote, once a figure of unstoppable energy, became a man burdened by the weight of his own impossible ideals. The laughter that once filled the pages turned bittersweet, preparing readers for the inevitable conclusion of his story. Don Quixote's final days and death. After countless adventures, defeats, and humiliations, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza returned to their village. What began as a grand quest to restore the age of knighthood ended as a weary march back home. The return to La Mancha. Don Quixote arrived in La Mancha, not as the triumphant knight he had imagined, but as an older, broken man. His armor was dented, Rocinante was frail, and his body carried the marks of years of misadventures. Yet through it all, Sancho remained by his side, faithful to the very end. The final realization, as time passed, Don Quixote's health declined, but more painful than his illness was the slow awakening of his mind. For the first time, he admitted what others had always known, that he was not a knight-errant, but Alonso Quixano, a man who had let books of chivalry cloud his judgment. In a moment of clarity, he renounced the fantasies that had ruled his life. He confessed that knights, castles, sorcerers and giants existed only in stories. With humility and sorrow, he begged forgiveness for the trouble his madness had caused. Sancho's loyalty. Sancho, heartbroken, pleaded with him not to abandon his dreams. He urged his master to rise once more, to seek new adventures, to believe in Dulcinea and the glories of knighthood. But Don Quixote, now clear-headed, shook his head. "There are no more adventures," he said. "The dream has ended." Death of a dreamer. Soon after, Don Quixote fell into his final illness. Surrounded by loved ones, he died peacefully, no longer Don Quixote de la Mancha, but once again Alonso Quixano. His death was not marked by heroism or glory, but by acceptance of reality, of mortality, and of the limits of human dreams. Legacy of Don Quixote. Though his life ended in defeat, his spirit endured. Don Quixote's refusal to abandon his ideals, even in the face of ridicule and failure, made him immortal in literature. Cervantes left the world not just a story of madness, but a meditation on hope, imagination, and the human soul's endless longing for meaning. Themes: madness, reality, and idealism. Cervantes did not simply write a tale of a foolish man chasing imaginary battles. Don Quixote is a profound exploration of the human condition, filled with themes that continue to resonate across centuries. Madness versus sanity. At the center of the novel is the question, what does it mean to be mad? Don Quixote saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. To his neighbors he was insane. To readers, however, he became something more complex, a man whose madness revealed truths about courage, justice, and hope. Cervantes invites us to wonder whether Don Quixote was truly mad, or whether the world itself had gone mad for abandoning ideals. Reality versus illusion. The clash between reality and illusion runs through every chapter. Windmills become giants, inns become castles, and peasants become princesses. Don Quixote's refusal to accept reality seems laughable at first, but it raises a deeper question: how much of life is shaped by what we choose to believe? For Cervantes, imagination is not a weakness, it is the very force that gives life meaning. Idealism versus practicality. Through the pairing of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, Cervantes presents the eternal conflict between dreamers and realists. Don Quixote embodies idealism, chasing noble causes even when they lead to disaster. Sancho represents practicality, focused on food, comfort, and survival. Together they show that life requires both vision and grounding, that dreams without reason are dangerous, but reason without dreams is empty. Social satire. Beyond philosophy, Don Quixote is also a satire of Spanish society. Cervantes mocked the outdated chivalric romances that once captivated readers, exposing their absurdity by showing what happens when someone actually tries to live them. In doing so, he critiqued not only literature, but also the hypocrisy of a society that valued appearances over truth. The human spirit. Above all, Don Quixote symbolizes the indomitable human spirit. Though he fails in every adventure, he never stops believing in something greater than himself. His courage, even in madness, reminds us that chasing dreams, even impossible ones, can be an act of profound dignity. When Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote in the early 1600s, he could not have imagined the impact his novel would have. More than 400 years later, it remains one of the most influential works in human history, often called the first modern novel and a cornerstone of world literature. Influence on writers and thinkers. Great authors from Dostoevsky to Dickens, from Flaubert to Borges, have drawn inspiration from Don Quixote's adventures. Philosophers, too, have debated its themes of madness, freedom, and identity. The character of Don Quixote became a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle between ideals and reality, a symbol beyond literature. The phrase "tilting at windmills" entered languages worldwide, describing hopeless battles against imaginary foes. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza became cultural archetypes, the dreamer and the realist, the idealist and the pragmatist. Painters like Picasso, composers like Strauss, and countless filmmakers have reimagined their story. Eternal relevance. What makes Don Quixote timeless is its universality. Every generation finds itself in its pages. The dreamer who refuses to bow to reality, the loyal friend who grounds him, the society that mocks those who dare to live differently. It is a novel about Spain, but also about the human soul. By blending humor with tragedy, fantasy with realism, Cervantes created more than a parody of chivalric tales. He gave the world a meditation on hope, resilience, and the dignity of pursuing dreams, even when failure is certain. In the end, Don Quixote may have died defeated, but his story lives on as a triumph. He reminds us that while reality may break the body, imagination keeps the spirit alive. And so, with every new reader, Don Quixote saddles up Rocinante once more, ready to tilt at windmills in the endless battlefield of human dreams. If you enjoyed this summary of Don Quixote, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. More detailed summaries of world classics are on the way. Stay tuned and join our community of readers.